Hello, health and fitness lovers of the world. Welcome back to Base. We are so excited to be bringing you another great mind. Today we have a very special guest. He is a scientist. He has a PhD in clinical neuroscience. He is a senior university lecturer for anatomy and physiology with a passion for educating people on the functioning of the human body. Dr. Mike Todorovic is our go-to scientist. Welcome to the show, Doc.
Hey team, thanks for having me.
Thanks
for joining us.
Hey, Doc.
We're so excited to have you on here. Mike, can you
I'm excited to be here.
tell us a little bit about yourself?
So basically, like Felicia said, I have a PhD in clinical neuroscience. I did my undergraduate degree in biomolecular science, which doesn't really exist anymore. It's just a science degree, basically, and got first class honors for that, and then moved on to the PhD where I focused on the genetics of Parkinson's disease. That's what my PhD was on.
Wow.
And currently I'm a senior lecturer of Anatomy and Physiology at Griffith University. And I have PhD students doing research on spinal cord injury and also looking at pain in dementia. So I'm basically a human body generalist.
Amazing. Wow. And you're a podcaster too, and we love your podcast. You simplify everything. You make everything sound so easy about the human body when it's just so complex, but not the way you explain it.
Yeah, I love education. Love trying to simplify complex topics. I've got a podcast with a colleague of mine, Dr. Matt. And so the podcast is Dr. Matt and Dr. Mike's Medical Podcast. So I have to plug it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course. We want you to plug it.
I've got a YouTube channel as well where I talk about the human body.
Yeah, and you've got a lot of subscribers.
Yeah, I think we've got 60,000 subscribers now for that, which is quite good. And we're on ABC Radio every week talking about the human body. We do a lot of outreach, basically, of education.
My thing is Instagram, and I come to you every day, and I obviously check your stuff every day, and you've got a little anatomy lesson, and it's a nice little top-up. So it's just a great all-round guy and a great all-round guy to be following, especially if you're in the fitness and wellness industry. As Felicia said, it keeps everything simple, but it's very technical at the same time. But today, actually, the main reason why we wanted to chat to you, I'm listening to you tell us what your PhD was on. It's a little bit different to the topic that we want to be discussing.
We're going to discuss many topics over the coming months, though, with you, Mike.
Absolutely. I think we'd love to have you. Like, I am glad that we have connected. Months ago, you came to my gym many months ago, and I'm so happy that we've connected with you because we'd love for you to be our go-to kind of science guy. We love to debunk stuff from time to time.
But we actually forgot to mention that you have an interest in training. I guess that's why you started kind of touching base with Sebastian.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely.
You like training for yourself? What's the interest there?
Yeah, both my wife and I, we love fitness, love training. I basically came across Bass's page on Instagram, saw what he does, and saw that it was no bullshit, which you don't get when you've got coaches, fitness trainers, PTs. There's always some little angle that they're taking, some way of selling a particular product, which sort of just tweaks the truth a little bit or is just downright not correct. But I liked Bass's basic approach, which is actually, it's not a basic approach, it's a complex approach, but it works on the basic principles which are true. And so I basically reached out to Bass, wanted to see if we could do something together. Bass and Andrew was kind enough to let me come down to one of your sessions down in Sydney with my colleague, Dr. Matt, who we do the podcast with. And I am constantly learning every day from what you're doing. So, I mean, I love the fact that on Instagram now, you can be an educator and you can learn at the same time. I'm learning stuff every day from what I'm seeing, from what you're putting out, which is just awesome.
It's crazy. That's the biggest compliment, man. Like, this is a guy here with a PhD kind of saying that he's learning off me. And that's how I felt when I had you guys in our seminars. And I remember just going, far out, these guys are making me nervous. These guys are the biggest brains in the room. And I remember looking over to you guys for approval when we're going through the functional anatomy of all of the movements, going, how am I going, guys? and I had the nod of approval from you guys. So it's like,
your knowledge of anatomy is actually really good, Bass.
It's a few levels below these guys, but it's definitely good enough to be able to teach the level that I'm teaching at, for sure. But anyway, that was a huge compliment. Thank you very much for that. What we do, I'm sure that you understand what we do, but we train all sorts of people. My audience is very different to Base Body Babes' audience. I train all sorts of people, usually athletic population, and the girls train women only, so they discriminate. They won't touch you if you're a dude. Sorry to say.
When you put it that way.
But fair enough.
You know, we're always comparing methods with each other and also comparing feedback from our audiences. Like, for example, I get girls that come to me that have goals of competing in powerlifting competitions and strong woman competitions. Girls that don't really, their main priority is performance over appearance. And they've definitely got different goals to the girls that come to the Base Body Babes for their own training. And I'd say that the main audience that the Base Body Babes have are more general population. What do you say the main goal is? Not performance.
No, it's well more aesthetic.
Aesthetic and general wellness.
Yeah.
General health.
And there's a lot of things that we talk about. They're very proper with the way that they deliver their information. For example, something that I go by with the aesthetic goals of a lot of the women that come to me is most women have a goal to be lower body dominant. A lot of the girls that I train, when they get to a certain point with their bench press, like I've got girls that are approaching 100 kilo bench presses, which is for a female, it's really heavy, right? I'm sure everyone can agree. But then they get to a point where they come to me and they say, I've had it a number of times, hey Bass, do you think that my pecs are going to stop growing if I continue to get stronger? And the answer is, well, no. That's like the muscle growth is an adaptation for your goals. Your goal is to lift a heavy weight, and you've got to build those muscles to support your goals. So what is your new goal? And it's like, well, I get to a point where they don't want to be benching anymore. And I say this to my girls when I start announcing out on social media saying women are lower body dominant, men are more upper body dominant. And Felicia and Dinny, they say to me, you can't be like that because there are girls that are more upper body dominant. And you're going to offend people. And I say, well, it's not a matter of being offensive. It's a matter of the feedback that I'm getting from my audience. If a girl comes to you and is more upper body dominant, do you train her to be even more upper body dominant? And the answer is no. Usually they have the goal of being more lower body dominant. Anyway, I would have to say that the basis of our training isn't so much on science and physiology, but it's more goal orientated. So if a girl comes to me and says to me, I want to be jacked, I'm going to help her get jacked. If a girl comes to me and says, I want to be petite and feminine, I'm going to say, you know what, why don't you go train with the Base Body Babes? But what we would love to do, although I said we're not really, like we're kind of guided by science, but not led by it, if that makes sense. But we would love to hear your take on the differences, the physiological differences between males and women, and how we can use that to, and not just us, our audience would love to hear the differences so that we can apply it to our training. And if there is any difference, but put goals aside, if there is any differences with the ways that we should train women to men, and why? What is your take on the anatomical and physiological differences between men and women and how it would relate to the differences that we should be training men and women?
It's a good question, and it's a big question. And I think the point that you made to begin with is a really important point, because I can start talking about stats. I can talk about the data that's been published within the literature, but that's an amalgamation of averages. And what coaches do and PTs do is they don't train the average population, they train very specific people. And so very specific people have very specific needs a lot of the time. And one person compared to another person can be vastly different. However, when you take a whole population and you average it out, these variances start to diminish. So I can easily talk to you today about the population differences. And I think this information is really important for coaches or PTs to have in their tool belt, but it should just be a guide. And I think the most important thing is to listen to your client, because your client's going to have very specific goals. And like you stated, the goal of aesthetics or the goal of being the strongest or the goal of whatever it may be, it may work hand in hand with health, or it may not go hand in hand with health. So the best thing in regards to the goal may not be the best thing in regards to health. And I'm sure we can all probably agree that certain types of sports or even certain types of physique training, especially to the extreme physique training for extreme athletes and for the stage, when you're on the stage, you're not in a healthy way.
No.
So you're not training for health in that point, but that could still be your goal. So there's a lot of important points, I think, to take into consideration. When we look at men and women and their particular needs and differences, there are obvious differences, but I think there's probably more similarities than differences. So if we were to write up males, write up females, draw a circle around them, and then see how much those two circles overlap, you'd find that probably more of those two circles overlap than don't overlap. Those differences are important, but so are the similarities. And so some obvious similarities are the fact that both men and women can put on muscle size. Both can hypertrophy, which is just growth in the size of the skeletal muscle, and both respond to resistance training and hypertrophy in response to resistance training, even the same type of resistance training. Obviously, men have a greater absolute strength and a greater absolute muscle bulk, but it doesn't mean women can't have this if they don't train. So other things that come into consideration are obviously things like the menstrual cycle, metabolic needs, demands. If a woman gets pregnant, for example, this can change things. So there's a whole bunch of different factors that can come into play.
It's an interesting thing that you say, men and women can both hypertrophy. They both have the potential for muscle growth. And it's a message that when we started off in the fitness industry, that it was kind of like the thing to do was to spread the word that women can't build muscle, so you shouldn't fear coming into the gym and training. And I came in and I've been working with, obviously I've been training with these girls for probably about 20 years, both of them.
Yeah.
And I know for a fact that women can build muscle. And these girls are petite, but I've definitely worked with women that step up on stage to do bodybuilding, women that power lift, and women that just have a goal of building muscle. Mm-hmm. And I know that, as I said, the main audience that I have is performance-based. And when someone comes to me and they go, I can bench 50 kilograms, for example, and I turn them into a 100-kilogram bench presser, there's an adaptation that occurs, and that is muscle growth. Their body has to adapt in a way that's going to be able to handle the demands of their weight training, and muscles grow. And we go and spread the message. Actually, women can build muscle, but it's not such a bad thing because, we can help you with exactly where you want to build that muscle. Like we've got a good understanding of movement and all of the exercises. This is what our expertise is. And we've had times where women come on and they say, you shouldn't be spreading that message that women can build muscle because it's going to scare people off. And it's like, you know what? That's just dumb because there's absolutely nonsense. Women can build muscle. And I think people need to be educated on that. And I think the difference is how you actually train is what is important. You have to be able to understand all of the movements, and exactly where you can be building muscle is up to you. And actually, women with muscle can and is actually quite beautiful, actually. That's my preference. I like the determination. I like to see a woman has work ethic as well. And that's what's actually really appealing to me. And I know that a lot of people share my opinion. But as you say, science will tell you that women can hypertrophy. Do you think with your research that there is a difference with the rate of hypertrophy between a male and a female and what that comes down to?
So if you have a look at some of the studies that come out, if you basically normalize for body size and body shape and give both men and women a similar resistance training program, they'll both hypertrophy similarly, to the same degree, basically. There may be some differences in which women can hypertrophy a little bit more in the upper body compared to men, but it's basically similar. Now, obviously, absolute strength and absolute hypertrophy is different, which can be due to some innate differences between men and women, including hormone profiles and genetics and so forth. But they do hypertrophy in a similar way, in a similar fashion. And so they both do respond to resistance training.
So we've spoken about the similarities between men and women. What are some of the differences that you were talking about? Are they hormonal differences mainly?
Yeah, so you can have a look at, if you have a look at muscle fibers, for example, so we can all basically agree that you've got two major types of muscle fibers, the type 1 slow twitch, type 2 fast twitch. The type 1 muscle fibers, they love oxidative metabolism, so the slow burn, like using fatty acids as an energy resource. And the type 2 fast twitch muscle fibers generate a lot of force and they're glycogenic, they like breaking down glucose, but they're short lasting and they fatigue easy. And those type 1 fibers don't fatigue as easily. And so they're usually muscle fibers that are used for postural fibers, for example. Now, if you have a look at men and women and take cross-sectional areas and have a look at the fiber differences, you'll find that Generally speaking, women probably have more type 1 fibers compared to men. However, this is very muscle group specific. And so if we look at muscles like the biceps, for example, which is often looked at in these types of studies, women tend to have more type 1, slow, fatigue, resistant fibers compared to men. And vastus lateralis as well seems to be a higher propensity for type 1. Again, there's always a bias sitting in here because researchers can only look at muscles that are easy to look at and biopsy muscles that are easy to biopsy. So we have to extrapolate that data. And so there's some studies that are saying that, overall, the fiber difference isn't that different. But there are other studies that basically say, well, you could probably say that women overall have a propensity for type 1 fibers compared to type 2. So what that could mean is women potentially would be better at more endurance type of training, fatigue-resistant training. And so there's some studies out there comparing males to females, looking at resistance training. I think it may have been the bench press, looking at a 1RM and then looking at how long the recovery time is before they can do their 1RM again. And it seems that for women, the time period is far shorter than that for men. And so their recovery period is far shorter. So women seem to fatigue less and recover earlier. And this this type of information can be used any way you want, I suppose, but you could potentially extrapolate that out and make an argument that maybe women could take higher loads in regards to their training and could do split training sessions. They could take higher loads but do a morning and evening session. Maybe for men, lower loads, heavier weight, one session, longer rest period. So there is some snippets of evidence in the literature stating that this may be the case.
So the first thing that comes to my mind when I train someone that has an endurance background, I guess the science could say that they've developed their type 1 fibers a little bit better than they've developed their type 2 fibers. And so they come to me and they're type 1 dominant, and it would take me a longer time to develop those type 2 fibers, and they'll always be showing some type of characteristics of an endurance style of athlete. When we're talking about percentages of 1 rep max. So if you get 85% of your max, someone who's type 1 dominant will be able to perform more reps of 85% of their max than someone who's fast twitch dominant. But I've always said that it kind of doesn't really matter to me. I'll train someone based on their goal, not on what I think their fiber type makeup is. So if someone comes to me and they've got an endurance background and they want to compete in a sport like powerlifting where they have to perform a 1 rep max, I believe that I can train that person to be great at 1 rep maxing. It's a skill. As well as, long-term training, developing the right muscles. Is there, the studies, I always say, who are they performing these studies on? Is it a matter of when they look at a woman and say they're more type 1 dominant, is that lifestyle dependent? Are they getting women who just don't have a history in training and the men that they're training, they're kind of brought up on more explosive sports? Do you think that has... plays a role in the study results? Like, who are they performing these studies on?
Yeah, absolutely. The studies are variable, and you have some studies that look at this in athletes, but most of the studies look at untrained people. And they look at untrained people because they assume that when they do some sort of intervention, and it may be resistance training or aerobic training or whatever it may be, that they're going to have more noticeable difference. And they often do have more noticeable differences because obviously there is a ceiling effect in which people who are well trained are closer to the ceiling, and there's going to be the percentage difference is going to be less significant. So a lot of these studies are performed in untrained individuals. I think it's important to have a look at the fact that if somebody's untrained, then there's going to be a greater capacity to get better. And so males, generally speaking, have probably got some baseline level of training greater than females for the average population. And so when we look at these particular studies, the significant difference seems to happen with the untrained women and not as much with the untrained men because of potential ceiling difference.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I like that too. Now, we've spoken about the muscles. Now, can we talk about fat distribution between men and women? Is there a physiological reason why we distribute fat in different areas of our body?
So when we look at fat distribution and fat percentages, so on average, women tend to have about 10% more fat being carried around their body compared to men at any given time. And the distribution is also different. And exactly like what you said, it tends to be gluteal femoral region. So the arse and hips basically is where it's stored for women. And for men, it's more around that midsection. What we find is that for women, it's more subcutaneous fat. So it's sitting underneath the skin, which is beneficial in the sense that it can be utilized as an energy substrate if needed. For men, it tends to be more intra-abdominal, so deeper fat, more visceral fat around the organs, for example, and it's harder to utilize that fat for energy. What we see, and this is really interesting in the literature, if we just talk about general health, having that extra 10% for females and having it distributed to the gluteal femoral region is actually cardiometabolically protective for women. But for men, it's not. And so what we find is that men, the more weight that they have, if men had that extra 10% around their midsection or even around the gluteal femoral region, they would be more at risk of cardiometabolic effects. So this is things like heart attack, stroke, diabetes, things like that. So this fat percentage difference in distribution is protective for women. Now, we don't necessarily know why it's the case. We know it's hormonally driven in part because we know that as women age and they become more postmenopausal, the estrogen levels begin to drop, and the dropping with estrogen seems to correlate with that fat actually being distributed in different areas. So now that fat starts to move to the midsection, and now that cardioprotective effect disappears. And we know that if women take estrogen as a hormone replacement therapy, that it can mitigate some of these changes. So it is hormonally driven in part. A really interesting point is that women tend to utilize fatty acids as a metabolic substrate more than men. Men tend to love using glucose for energy. Women tend to love using fatty acids. And so the fact that women have a high percentage of subcutaneous fat that's readily available is beneficial, especially when we look at the menstrual cycle and we look at fertility years and have a look at the different phases of the menstrual cycle. When we look at, so basically, when we look at the menstrual cycle, we've got 0 to 28 days on average, right? And we've got from 0 to 14, day 14, right, smack in the middle on average again is ovulation. The first 14 days is what we call the follicular phase. We're preparing the egg. That egg's getting ready for ovulation. There's two major hormones that are at play here, which is luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. The luteinizing hormone is what stimulates that egg to ovulate and get released into the fallopian tubes, and that spikes right up just before day 14. After day 14, we've got the luteal phase, and this is characterized by spikes in both estrogen and progesterone. And those two hormones are anabolic. So they're anabolic steroid hormones, and they're anabolic in the sense that they promote growth of the uterine lining. They're preparing it for egg implantation. So it's increasing vascularization, it's increasing nutrient demand, it's increasing the muscle thickness of that endometrial wall as well. So it's anabolic, but it's not just anabolic for the uterus. We know estrogen, for example, is anabolic for bones and muscle as well, because we know, again, in postmenopause, that muscle growth diminishes, and we also know that bone density diminishes. Another reason why hormone replacement therapy can be utilized to stop any osteoporotic effects that can happen in postmenopause. So even the menstrual cycle has these hormonal effects, and the hormonal effects can affect anabolic, catabolic phases. It seems to be in that luteal phase where we've got high estrogen, high progesterone. The metabolic demand for the woman increases as well, and their utilization of fatty acids and proteins goes up. And we can see this when we look in bloods. A couple of studies, I think a study came out in Nature maybe a year or two ago that looked at blood plasma levels of certain nutrients, vitamins, minerals, nutrients. And they saw that in the luteal phase that fatty acids were down, amino acids were down, which indicated that they were being utilized for growth. And so it tends to be an anabolic phase in that luteal phase. So an argument could potentially be made that a caloric demand or even a nutrient demand for fatty acids and proteins go up in the last phase of the cycle.
So should we consider that and think of monitoring a menstrual cycle of a female and potentially advising a calorie surplus during that time?
It's difficult because each individual is different.
I think as a woman, we naturally just want those extra calories at that time anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
That explains the cravings.
This is a really important point, is that the the menstrual cycle and the hormone levels, there is a tight interplay there with behavior. And women are really, really good at knowing exactly what's happening with their cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have these really important cues that come through. And the cues can be, I need more calories coming in. The cues could be, I'm a bit tired, I don't want to train. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of a bit of a protective effect. Or I feel like I've got my energy back. Let's go train. And so these are really important to listen to, because it's your body basically telling you what's happening and what stage of the cycle you're in. So this is where the point I made at the beginning was, we can look at all the data and we could take the averages and we could make inferred decisions from it. Mm-hmm. But you could also ask your client and just say, how are you feeling? Some clients may have a lot of menstrual pain during menstruation or discomfort, and this may stop them from being able to engage in exercise. And so there may actually be, things that are physically stopping them from training. Also, never forget, sorry, I just dropped my camera. Never forget the psychological aspect of all this. Mm-hmm. And so there's obviously mood changes that occur and behavioral changes that occur, and sometimes people just don't feel like training.
Sure,
and
you should come and spend a day with us at our female-only studio. We get something different every day.
Or maybe you shouldn't, actually. I wouldn't recommend it. It's an interesting thing that you're talking about. It's like the body knows what it needs. When a girl craves, it's because she's actually needing it. And in my experience, I think it's quite difficult to be intuitive. So us being the professionals, we would get women that come to us to be guided by us and say, we've got a fat loss journey. This is our goal. What's the recommendation? And let's just put it simply. The recommendation would be to go on a calorie deficit. What are we doing to the body when it is going through this anabolic phase, the luteal phase, and we are depriving from nutrients that it's asking for based on the overall goal is fat loss. I know you feel hungry, but your goal is fat loss, so we're going to maintain this calorie restriction. Are we doing damage by not listening to the body at this time?
So there is something called the female athlete triad. And the female athlete triad is basically characterized by 3 particular things. And these things can include things like dysmenorrhea or amenorrhea, which is a change in the period or an absence of the period. Mm-hmm. It could also be associated with a reduction in calorie intake, but potentially just not eating enough food, and can also be characterized by bone mineral loss. So these are the 3 characteristics of this athletic triad. And when we look at this, so you look at female athletes, and you find that, depending on the type of athlete, there's a 20% increase in them having amenorrhea, so no period, compared to the population being 5%. So there's a correlation between exercise or athleticism, particularly in the extreme, and changes to physiology. And that can include the menstrual cycle. And I think it's important because when we think about the luteal phase, like Bass was saying, that the metabolic demand increases because it's every month the female body is thinking, a baby's coming, I'm going to get an implantation. And so it does whatever it can to prepare for that. And so if there's not enough nutrients, not enough fatty acids, not enough glucose, not enough proteins present in order to sustain that, then the body has to make decisions. Mm-hmm. And so some of these decisions can include the fact that, there's not enough nutrients to focus my energy on if a egg gets implanted to develop that. And so it puts things into an imbalance. And so I always talk with my students about homeostasis. Homeostasis is what controls everything in the body. Mm-hmm. It's a happy, healthy range for everything. So there's no one particular number that's beneficial for anything. So there's no one oxygen saturation. There's no one blood glucose level. There's no one anything. It's always a range. Mm-hmm. Too high disease, too low disease. Mm-hmm. That's just how the body works. Mm-hmm. And so if we look at, there's going to be a range of nutrient demand that you can sit within. If you go too low, then you're going to be not looking after yourself. And that can result in, like I said, amenorrhea. It can result in changes in hormones and can result in bone mineral density issues, again, if happening long term. The good thing is that for a lot of these women who do lose their period through training, most just get it back once they drop the training a little bit and increase the nutrient intake.
Yeah, I personally went through that. I lost my period for 3 years.
So it can happen. But a lot of the time it can just come back because the body it's this oscillatory circadian, hormone-driven, pumping out hormones at specific times. And even if it's suppressed due to the contraceptive pill or suppressed due to metabolic demand due to exercise, it kicks back in once things get back into that happy, healthy range.
And is there is it detrimental to like childbearing stages, or is it fine? Like, does it repair quite quickly?
Generally speaking, it's fine.
Okay.
So I'm good. I'll be able to have a baby at some point.
Hopefully.
Okay.
So okay, where we're getting with that, something that I don't really speak to the girls so much about is their periods. I kind of keep away from them if I know that they've got them.
You just have to deal with it once a month.
Yeah,
he tells me that I'm in a mood for three weeks of the month, so 3 out of 4 weeks.
And then he's got me
I'm dealing
on the
with
back
my
end of
period.
that. So you don't get a break, mate.
That's right. It's tough being the only guy sometimes. But yeah, so like Dinah just said now, 3 years.
3 years,
of
no
period.
Now that was because of overtraining.
And
probably a calorie deficit.
And they're back.
Absolutely.
They're back.
They're back now.
When do they come back?
I've probably had them regular now for about 4 years.
Right.
Yeah.
So would you say she's just back to normal, or do you think there's long-term effects that can happen if a girl? I'd say this was the time when Diana and I were training very closely together, and she was really strong, really lean. She was doing everything by the books.
That was 6 days a week training.
6 days a week training, and they were 2 to 3 hour long sessions, and she was a machine. And anyway, so she's saying she lost her period at that time.
Yeah.
Is it like I would get people that come to me, the population of the clientele that comes to me are performance orientated. Is that something that I should be aware of? Like, could I be creating long-term damage on my women? It's not just Diana, actually. I had a girl that came to me asking me, she wanted to survey me. She was doing a study on performance and menstrual cycle. And she said to me, you've got some amazing women that you're training. They're all really strong. Do you change their programming around their menstrual cycle? And I said, to be honest with you, my 3 strongest women that I train have all lost their cycle. And I kind of felt a little bit guilty about that. It's like, shit, is that a trend? Like, is this a really bad thing? Am I safe to say that Diana's back to normal, or have we created long-term damage?
As far as I can tell, the evidence states that in most cases, once homeostasis has been restored, in the sense that, and it doesn't take a lot. The evidence states that it only takes something like a 10 to 15% decrease in activity and a specific increase in metabolic nutrient intake in order for things to be restored. Again, everybody's different. A generalization is exactly that, a generalization, taking an average of a population. Every individual would need to be evaluated for themselves. But most of the time, once those things are restored, it just kicks straight back in.
I mean, I had a few other issues. I had PCOS and endometriosis, so mine, I think it just took a little bit longer. But in terms of increasing my calories and then decreasing my training,
that's all it takes.
I think.
And so there are many factors, like you were just stating. I mean, in an individual where everything else is basically normal and there's no endometriosis, there's none of those types of things, then usually it will just kick back in. Everyone's different. Yeah. So I think that's a really important point. And so there can be other factors. So you may do the right thing and you may bring those calories back in, you may drop the training, and there may not be a recovery of the period, at least not straight away. Yeah. And this is the type of thing that women should have a conversation with their OBGYN about. And so they'll be able to talk about specifics, and they'll be able to talk exactly about what hormones are happening at what particular time and nutrient demands and so forth.
One of the other questions we wanted to ask was, is there a healthy body fat percentage between men and women? What is that?
That's a really hard question. So
ranges, you like ranges.
Yeah, it's all ranges. Well, ranges is safe for me, but ranges is also what's happening anatomically and physiologically. However, it's really difficult to identify a healthy range, because we've got to think about what are the parameters, what are the markers that we're looking at here for healthy. So again, if the goal is performance or the goal is physique, then obviously it's going to be very different. If the goal is general cardiometabolic health, it's going to be different as well. like I said earlier, you'll find that women will have about 10% more body fat, and that is healthy to have that increase in body fat. When it comes to specific numbers, I think throughout the lifetime of a man, on average, their body fat's around about 23 to 30%. And for a woman, it's around about 30 to 40%. But again, it's a range, fluctuates.
That's much higher than what I thought.
I like this one as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've got experience with DEXA scans and all of these things, but I've heard that a lot when people say, oh, up on stage, 6% body fat. And I've heard actual science saying, hang on a second, that's not a fact, because if you were 6% or less, you're dead. What's the facts on this percentage thing?
Yeah, so it's difficult because every different measurement for body fat will give a little bit of a different reading because they do it differently. So you got DEXA, you've got, displacement of water, you've got displacement of air, you've got infrared, you've got all these different ways of doing it. And there's different types of fat, right? So there's the adipose fat that we, sit underneath our ass and our hips and our gut, and that's used for energy. But there's also brown fat, which we often store around our neck and shoulder region, and that's there for heat production. And so I'm not sure whether these different methodological approaches determine the differences. Yeah. So I would be, personally, and again, everyone's goal is different, but I'd be less inclined to focus on the fat percentage, unless it's really high or really low, obviously, and focus on what the goal is. And so you can be, for lack of a better term, fit and fat. It really depends on the type. So there's people who would be considered overweight with BMI, but they're healthy. I mean, I'm sure Bass is obese if
Morbidly.
I were to do his BMI.
Yeah,
morbidly.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. But again, that's a number representative of, weight according to stature squared, right? Yeah. So it's a little algorithm that they use. And BMI is actually really good for the general population to associate it with health issues. It's actually a really good marker of that. But when you've got a bodybuilder or a power lifter coming in, and their BMI looks obese, but in actual fact, their cholesterol's great, all their markers are really good, they're healthy, they're fit, it's not the best measurement to use. And so
I agree.
My question would be, why would one or an individual be focusing on their fat percentage? What is their goal? What is their aim for that? And so I think that should be driving everything.
Yeah, interestingly, I think it's just one of those useless pieces of trivia that people just like to know the number. I'm asked that a lot of the times. So just let's just get, I don't know if there is a science behind this, but would you have any idea about, you see Mr. Olympia, guys like Ronnie Coleman or Phil Heath or whatever, would you just based on the numbers that you just spat out, like a healthy range for a male, did you say that it was around 30%? To me, that sounds like a really fat guy.
Yeah. That's fine.
So 30% is, I should have been more specific. As you age, both males and females increase their body fat percentage. And so by the time you're in your 70s, the average is around about 30%. Right. But when you're younger and you're in your early 20s, it's 23%-ish.
Yeah. Okay. So either way, that's still a lot higher than my perception of what a good body fat percentage should be. So it's a common number that guys are going for is 10%. Like to say I'm sub 10% means you're shredded. Is sub 10% is that just an incorrect number?
Well, I mean, again, it's for me exactly like you said. In my eyes, it's arbitrary. Yeah. What is it? Is it just something they can hold on to and wave it like a flag?
I think so.
This is me. And I think a lot of people like to do that. They like to have proxies that represent who they are or what they are. And numbers tend to be big on that. I mean, I had a DEXA scan at work because the athletics department was doing it. I said, yeah, do a DEXA scan. And the guy that was the rep that was running, I think I was 11%. And he goes, oh, congratulations, that's great. And I said, great for what? And he goes, oh, it's just really good. I said, really good for what? And he goes, as a number. And I'm like,
people like numbers.
It's embedded in our culture. It's embedded in our minds that there's a number and the number's a goal and we have to hit that goal no matter what. But I mean, Are you happy in yourself? Are you fit? Are you healthy? Are you doing all the things that you want to be able to do? Are you hitting your goals, which may be certain lifts or certain looks? And if you're hitting those, what does the number truly mean? If you're a physique competitor, you're up on stage, do they ask you for your numbers? I don't know if they do.
They definitely do.
Hey, I'm coming in at 10%, guys.
Exactly.
So on this topic of body fat, something that I've heard, I don't know if it was just like one of those useless pieces of trivia conversations where it could be a complete load of crap, but I'd like to know if you know anything about this. A man it's innate that a male is attracted to a fatter backside of a female because it tells that male that she's healthy enough, she's got a body fat percentage that is high enough to be in the healthy range to bear a child. Is there any merit to this, or is it just like a funny joke?
So, funnily enough, there's heaps of research on this.
Right.
And some of it's a bit dubious and spurious, and a lot of it's based on evolutionary psychology.
Yeah. It makes sense.
It makes sense to me.
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
And it does make sense if you look at it superficially, it makes sense. But what humans are really good at is drawing lines between two things that aren't correlated and just correlating them. Now, from what I can tell from what's been published, and I'm not an evolutionary psychologist at all, but these tend to be the three main answers to your question. So what the research talks about is waist to hip ratio. And so they have a look at a number of individuals. They poll a number of males and they ask them to evaluate images of women who have different waist to hip ratios. And the lower the waist to hip ratio means basically the tighter the hip, the tighter the waist, the wider the hip, right? Which is the point that you were getting at before. Now, it tends to be that among multiple populations, that the lower the waist to hip ratio, the more attractive it's perceived by the participant, by the male participant. All right. And then the question is why? And so an argument could be made that it is an indirect or direct reference to fertility. And so maybe it's an indication that a woman who has a lower waist to hip ratio is more fertile. Not a lot of evidence to suggest that is the case, but that could be a particular theory. Another theory is that maybe it's just population specific. Maybe in all these studies, they're polling 17-year-old college boys, and that's what 17-year-old college boys like. And maybe if you go to a different age, or maybe if you go to a different cultural population, maybe another part of the planet, it's not necessarily the case. And then the third factor, which I'm inclined does play a role to some degree, is that our opinion of attractiveness, there's a degree that's innate, but also a degree that is culturally influenced. Sure. And I wouldn't be surprised that over the past 60 to 100 years that the media has demonstrated that, hey, this is what's attractive, a low hip to waist ratio, and therefore it gets embedded in the psyche. And then when you ask a person that, they're basically primed to answer that question. And so their answer is going to be, I find the low waist to hip ratio the most attractive. So it is actually a lot more complex than it first looks. I think it's probably a combination of all of it. I don't think you could dispel one or another. I think it's a combination of all together.
So can we just go back to the pregnancy talk and go back to postpartum? Well, I'm the only one in this room that's had a kid, or he made me had a kid. But yeah, so
not in the same way though.
No, when we had our daughter, I was able to get back into the best shape of my life. Now, is this something that is common that you see or science sees with women? Is there something that happens hormonally to our bodies that enables us to get back in better shape? I don't know. I was able to achieve good body composition goals, and I just want to know if that's something that happened to me hormonally.
So that could potentially be you specifically. My wife, for example, after
She's
we
got
had
abs,
our
mate.
daughter.
She looks great.
I know, and she had a C-section too. So those abs are after having a C-section.
Yeah, wow.
So, but again, I think what's probably a really important factor here, I could be wrong, but what's an important factor here is fitness prior to pregnancy.
Yeah.
And so if an individual is quite fit prior to pregnancy, there's going to be probably a better recovery period and a better rebound period, shorter rebound period, basically. Now, my wife had a C-section, and so she was bedridden for a couple of days. But, apart from that, you've got the separation of the abs that is common and that occurs, and you've got to be very careful with that abdominal separation. And with a C-section, you're obviously cutting through multiple tissue layers, skin, muscle, fat, fascia, and so forth. And so recovery is needed there. But I think a lot of the time, once the baby is born, hormones are going to be produced, which are going to now be protective for nutrients for that baby. So it's going to be things like oxytocin and progesterone. Oxytocin and prolactin are the two hormones that are going to start shooting through the roof. And oxytocin we always think about as the love molecule, I think, if you've probably heard of it like that. Yeah. But I always tell my students oxytocin is the love-hate molecule because they did some studies and they showed that tribal individuals who were just about to go to war, they had a look at their blood serum and the oxytocin was through the roof. And so oxytocin is there to solidify relationships, whether it's good or bad. And the interesting thing for oxytocin with pregnancies, oxytocin is there to solidify relationships, but it's also there for milk letdown. So oxytocin contracts muscles. And so it contracts the muscles of the breast tissue to push that milk out, but it's also the hormone that gets released during labor to contract the uterus to push the bub out as well. So oxytocin is really important.
How long do we have that oxytocin release for postpartum?
You'll have varying degrees of oxytocin being released throughout your whole life, basically.
Right. But it's just
it spikes
elevated
with
at that time. And then with breastfeeding, so I breastfed for 19 months, and I guess it was probably after.
That's great.
Yeah, really long time. It was probably towards that end, maybe a year and a half, where I really got heavy into my training and really focused on it. But yeah, I got really lean at that time.
I think you were in your best shape probably about 2 years.
Was it 2 years after?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so how long do how long till we come back to that balanced level of hormones after childbirth?
Is there a number?
So you breastfeeding for, what did you say? 19 months, did you say? 19 months. Okay. So historically, we breastfed for up to 3 years postpartum, sometimes 4 years, because milk was the primary energy source for infants. And so hormone levels are going to be, again, favored for feeding the bub. And then a lot of nutrients coming in are going to be favored for that as well, because bub's getting things like not just nutrients, but is getting your antibodies, it's getting protective factors and chemicals in your breast milk as well, which is obviously going to help bub. And so a lot of energy goes into that. And so a lot of women, there's a high metabolic demand throughout that time. Often once the breastfeeding stops, things relatively quickly, hormonally wise, will go back to a normal rhythm. And this is one of the reasons why women, after having a baby, can have another baby relatively quickly soon after.
What is a healthy deficit if you're trying to achieve fat loss when you're breastfeeding?
I waited till after.
I mean,
my milk was dwindling down by that point anyway. So I was never. My aim was never to be in a calorie deficit. I was just fueling my body.
We definitely get loads of women who come and train with us postpartum who are wanting to achieve fat loss but are still breastfeeding. So what is a safe rate for them to be losing weight?
It's a good question, and I don't know if there's an answer to it, because obviously weight loss is a sum of calorie in, calorie out. What you take in, what you burn, and there's multiple factors coming into play here which were never there prior to bub, which is, I don't know how much energy you burn just by producing breast milk. And also how much sleep are you getting? A lot of people, if they don't get enough sleep, they tend to gain weight as well. So sleep is really important to maintain a whole bunch of other homeostatic functions. So I think there's too many factors to be able to make a statement on it. I think an individual would need to weigh it up. It would be really important for them to have the conversation with their GP or OBGYN and nutritionist or dietitian about it,
for sure.
Because it's probably not something that an individual should just do on a whim or on their own steam, because there's so many factors coming into play.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I think we are all at an hour, so we're going to wrap it up.
Absolutely.
For sure.
We'll definitely save that for another time. We'd love to have you back on. We've absolutely loved this chat today. I definitely learned a whole bunch.
Yeah,
so
so
thank
did
you
I.
so much, Doc.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for sharing your scientific perspective. I'm sure our audience has learned a lot as well. So, yeah, we're going to try and get you back on soon.
Thank you. And can I finish by saying that for those who are listening, if you find that the things that I've said or you guys have said doesn't match you, it's because the type of information that I've gathered, at least, is for that population, and it's generalistic.
Yeah.
And so you do need to listen to your own body, and I think coaches should listen to their clients as well in regards to how their bodies are, and that information from the literature is important, and it is scientific data, and it's useful, but it should be taken to inform your practice and inform best practice. And so don't ignore your client and say, well, this is what the literature says, so I'm going to ignore exactly how you feel about your body. Shouldn't be done whatsoever.
Yeah.
So for our audience, I'm sure they've loved listening to you. Where is the best place for them to find you?
So you can find me on Instagram at Dr. Mike Todorovic, DrMikeTodorovic. I need to find myself a shorter surname. My podcast, which is Dr. Matt and Dr. Mike's Medical Podcast.
Which is an amazing podcast.
Thank you. It's on basically every podcasting platform.
Yeah.
And you can hear us on ABC Radio every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. And YouTube. I'm on YouTube as well. So Dr. Matt and Dr. Mike on YouTube if you want to learn about how the human body works.
We'll put that in the notes so that they've got all of your exact plugs so they go straight to you.
So cool.
But, man, thank you again. It's been so great chatting with you. But we loved everything you spoke about.
Everything was great. You're amazing.
From our perspective, it was awesome. Thank you so much, my man.
Thanks, Tam.
Thanks, Mike.
Have a good one.
See ya.
Chat
See you later.
soon.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.